Good evening, everyone. My name is Professor Ann Amen, and I am the Dean of Natural Sciences here at PLU. Welcome to our 4th annual Rachel Carson Lecture. This lecture is funded by a generous donation from Dr. George Long, a PLU alumnus in biology and chemistry from the class of 1966, and his wife, Helen. Please join me in thanking George and Helen for helping to make this event possible. Before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and respect the traditional caretakers of this land, the Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin Island, and Steilacoom peoples. Tonight, it is my distinct honor to welcome back to campus our distinguished speaker, Dr. Willliam Foege, a 1957 graduate of PLU with a degree in biology. He subsequently earned an MD from the University of Washington and a master's in public health from Harvard. Dr. Foege is best known for his leading role in efforts to eradicate infectious diseases, including smallpox, polio, and measles. In the 1970s, Dr. Foege served as the director for the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, and in 1986, he became executive director of the Carter Center, where he continues to serve the organization as a senior fellow. He also serves as a senior fellow for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Global Health Program and is a professor emeritus at Emory University. For his lifelong commitment to improving the lives of people of all nations, Dr. Foege was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama in 2012. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Foege.
Thank you, Ann. It's always so hard to follow a nice introduction because it's going to be downhill, I can tell you, from this point on. And I would like to thank the Longs for making this possible. And I would like to thank President Belton and the entire PLU people who made this possible. What a nice job they did. What a great day we had meeting with students, getting a lot of questions. And I'd like to thank everyone who's here tonight, because I realize you had options. You could be watching politicians on TV. Some years ago, while I was attending a board meeting, and Gary, I think you were chairing it, the faculty chair started his report by saying that this was the end of his term and that there would be a new chair at the next meeting. He said, I took this job because I thought it was a possible thing to do that would be a contribution. But he said, I found I liked it. And then I found I actually loved it. And I asked my wife one day, would you in your wildest dreams have thought I would like a job like this? And she said, honey, I don't want to spoil you, but you've never figured in my wildest dreams. 3 objectives: to make some observations, to talk about Rachel Carson, and to ask what does her life tell us about our own lives. Observations: 66 years ago, as a PLU student, I had a wild dream of running a medical center in Africa for the rest of my life. And we went to Africa. We got in the middle of a civil war during the Nigerian-Biafran Civil War and had to leave the country, and my dream was ruined, and I'm so happy. Because I never would have been introduced to smallpox eradication or have the chance to work on guinea worm eradication or river blindness eradication, these programs. I never would have had the chance to work with President and Mrs. Carter or Melinda and Bill Gates, Jonas Salk. So you never know what the possibilities are going to be. And so I tell students, you can't imagine the opportunities you will have. So instead of spending time on a life plan, spend your time on a life philosophy. And then you end up with tools to make decisions at every fork in the road. And to do this, seek mentors that could help you. Mentors turn out to be one of the best predictors of how students will do after graduation. Two predictors. Did they have a mentor? Were they able to use their skills under supervision? Only a quarter of American graduates say they had a mentor, and I think that's just terrible. It's a system that we should be changing. My years at PLU were important in developing a philosophy, getting a few skills, but the most important thing is I met my wife 64 years ago at PLU, and we've been married 61 years. And she's the one responsible for the title of the book on House on Fire. Because I have, as I told some students today, I have bad vision and I have bad eyes, bad ears, and those are the best two things about me. But having lost much of my vision, I can still type. And so writing the book, House on Fire, I would type a chapter, I would email it to her, she would sit across the room and read it back, and then we could make corrections on the computer. And she repeatedly said, "This is really, really boring." And so she persuaded me to add stories in the book. And then halfway through the book, she said, "You should call this book House on Fire." And I won't spoil it for you. I guess it might spoil it if you read it. But halfway through the book, you'll suddenly understand why that was a brilliant suggestion, but it was her idea, not mine. I belong to another age. In global health circles, people no longer seek me out for science. They seek me out for history. I'm the Antiques Roadshow of global health. And even my early education was a different era. I spent my first 10 years in a rural area of Iowa. And I used to tell people I was first in my class in the slow group. And what's funny about that is there were only 3 people in my class. So develop your philosophy, and it requires work. I put on a seminar for students where I say in 60 minutes, you will have a list of the priorities in your life in priority order. And of course, no one believes they can do that. So I tell them, you're 30 years old, you have $1 million, what will you trade the entire million for, even if it means you spend the rest of your life in poverty or as a middle-class person? And they can't think of anything. So I give them scenarios. Your child's been kidnapped for $1 million, you could get your child back, would you do that? And you know, some of them play games and say, which child, and that. But the resolution is, yes, they would. And so I said, you've already determined relationships are worth more than $1 million. And then I tell them, you have been given a diagnosis of 6 months to live, but you could, for $1 million, buy a normal life expectancy. Would you do that? And of course they would. Would you do it for 30 years, 20 years, 10 years? So I bargain with them till we get to the point where they wouldn't do it. Why not? They would rather leave that money for a spouse and children than to have another 2 years of life. And I tell them it wasn't their fault, but they now have a jail sentence, life imprisonment. Do they want to be rich in jail? Or for $1 million they could get out and be poor and free? And you know the answer to that. I tell them they have a talent, but they can't use it unless they give up the $1 million. It ends up with they have a list of 6 or 7 things. If they have 7 things, I tell them the rules have changed, you can only have 6. Which one will you discard? And I do that until they come down to one thing. They now have a priority list of their priorities in priority order. And I ask them, how would they measure civilization? And as we get through all of the usual things that historians talk about, whether it's wisdom or money or technology or control of one's environment, or even happiness. They all have problems with them. But there's one thing that allows you to measure civilization, and that is how people treat each other. It becomes the mark of a civilized university, of a civilized political party, of a civilized country, a civilized individual. And that's one of the nice things about PLU. There are so many civilized people walking this campus. Why do we study history? From my point of view, it's not in order to avoid the mistakes of history. It's to realize that this is a cause and effect world. And if we were omnipotent, we could see all the causes and all the effects. But we see enough to know that that's true, that everything we have, technology and cars and the internet, religious rituals, philosophies, animals, plants, all of this comes from millions of things that happened. And if you realize that this is true, then you have to keep asking, what matters that I'm doing today? Stephen Hawking said that the history of science is the gradual realization that things do not happen in an arbitrary fashion. Every atom in you has been so many places before. It's been in popes, it's been in criminals, it's been in criminal popes, it's been in brilliant and slow people, it's been in pigs and worms and armadillos and pine trees, and those millions of atoms or billions of atoms combine with billions of other atoms to form you, the unique person sitting in that seat tonight. So once we totally accept this, the cause and effect, then we know everything we do today will ripple on forever. And it becomes important what we do today. Growing up, when I would hear the Good Samaritan story, the last question always was, who is your neighbor? And the answer was someone in another country, another ethnicity, a person that was very poor, that sort of thing. Never once growing up did I hear anyone say, your neighbor might be someone who won't be born for 300 years. And now that puts a different connotation on that story. So these neighbors of the future have given you their proxy. And they're asking you to be very careful in how you use it, to realize that climate change is for real, and that we have to put politicians in office that can save us from what will happen if we don't take those actions. That was the message of Rachel Carson. She was giving this message while I was here at PLU, and I didn't know it. And we think of her oftentimes in terms of chemicals and DDT and so forth. She was much broader than that. Her message was, how is science changing the future for the worse, even when we don't know that we're doing that? The power of science is awesome. But Huxley said, you know, science is simply common sense at its best. And then Will Durant said, add art to it, and you have creative common sense at its best. And he used Imhotep as the example of the first person we know by name who was both an artist and a scientist. He built the step pyramid in Egypt. He was a physician. And Will Durant said, this is something to aspire to for everyone, to be an artist and a scientist. But then Roger Bacon says, no, you can do better than that. You should seek creative and moral common sense at its best. Rachel Carson knew about Roger Bacon because 700 years earlier, he had prepared a paper for the Pope on science. And I read this about 50 years ago, but I still remember how enthusiastic he was about science. And he predicted cars and airplanes and submarines, but he said to the Pope, science has no moral compass. and the church is not doing anything to help that. Carson dedicated her book to Dr. Albert Schweitzer. He was an important figure in my life, and I consider him a mentor that I never met. Because I was a teenager north of Spokane in a town that did not have television, and I was in a body cast, and reading was my outlet. And I started reading about Albert Schweitzer. I couldn't imagine this man who had 3 earned PhDs before he was 30 years of age. To earn a PhD is quite an undertaking. To do this 3 times before you're 30. And then in addition, to be such a good organist that you give concerts, to be the world's authority on Bach, to be the world's authority on organ building. And then he concludes, I've enjoyed life so much that I have to spend the rest of my life helping other people. And at age 30, he entered medical school, got his 4th earned doctoral degree, and then went to Africa and spent the rest of his life till he died at age 90. And this was the beginning of my interest in both Africa and medicine. As an aside, I hoped to meet him, but he died the month that Paul and I went to Africa. But his daughter, his only child, ran the laboratory at the hospital where he worked, and she married a cardiologist who came to work for me at CDC, so I got to know his daughter. And I noticed that the books out there on Schweitzer at the edge of the primeval forest are on sale, and she asked me if I would write a new foreword for that book. And I did, and I read the book 50 years after reading it the first time. And the last story I have in my foreword is Schweitzer trying to move some lumber as he's building in his hospital. And a man walks by, and Schweitzer finds the lumber is too heavy and asks the man, would you help me carry this lumber? And the man says, no, I'm an intellectual. And Schweitzer said, I had always hoped to do that myself. So he became an early ecologist, and he developed a philosophy called Reverence for life. He said, up until now, ethics is concerned with how people interact with each other. From now on, ethics should be concerned with how humans interact with animals and plants and the entire environment. And so this is what Rachel Carson was trying to do in the 1960s. She was an unusual person. She was an early reader and published her first story at age 10. She became a marine biologist, and in the 1950s, she ended that in order to write full-time because people understood she was a good writer and she wanted to explain science to people. Her book, Silent Spring, came out in 1962. She was suffering from metastatic cancer at the time it came out, so she did not do much in the promotion. But the book was so powerful that it caused DDT to be halted in the United States and then in other parts of the world. It was the cause for the EPA to be formed, and President Carter gave her the Medal of Freedom posthumously, and I had a chance to tell President Carter that I was going to mention that tonight, that he had done that. So if you see him, let him know I did. What are the implications for us? Our grandson Max was about 6 or 7 years old, sitting in the back of the car, in the back seat, just the two of us in the car, and suddenly he asked me, what's the most important thing people could do to make the world better? And I felt like an ancient Greek, because the ancient Greeks did not see themselves as walking into the future. They saw themselves as backing into the future because they couldn't see it. And there was my future behind me, and I could only get glimpses of it. And I tried to give him an answer, and I've continued ever since trying to give him an answer. And a year or two ago, I was telling him one part of the answer has to be listen very carefully to what is happening in the world. And I told him about a colleague in the public health service who 50 years ago told me he had gone to college in Iowa. His roommate was from Australia. The roommate was asked repeatedly to speak at schools about Australia and to service clubs, and he became very good at it, but it was rote. Told the same story, he heard the same questions, he gave the same answers, and that was it. But one night, he's speaking at a Baptist church, and when he finished speaking, a man stood up and asked, "Are there many Baptists in Australia?" What this poor student heard in his mind was, "Are there many rabbits in Australia?" And he said, "Good Lord, they're the national nuisance." He said, "We hunt them and shoot them and poison them." But they just keep reproducing. So listen carefully to the world. And Rachel Carson asks in her book, what are the things that could actually make humans, like dinosaurs, a footnote to history? And I asked that in one of the classes today, and I was amazed that these students very quickly came up with the right things. So there are things that could destroy humanity, and there are other things that won't destroy humanity, but they sure make it more difficult to live. But in the destroy humanity category, the students came up immediately with nuclear weapons, and they're correct. We have for 75 years been playing brinksmanship, but it's becoming more complex as more and more people get the ability to make nuclear weapons. And it's the epitome of what we call asymmetry in war, where one person, if they were very smart, could use a nuclear weapon and make both Russia and the United States think the other one had started it. That is one problem. A second one, the students got this, was climate change. This could, in fact, leave us with no humans in the world. There's a movie out called Knives Out. Oh, some of you have seen it. And there's a young woman who, if she tells a lie, she throws up. And I thought, boy, wouldn't that have been a nice addition to creation? Because it still allows for free will. People can tell lies, but everyone is going to know it. But you wouldn't need fact checkers anymore in politics. You'd still have some politicians that continue to lie because they can't help it, but you could identify them because they would be on life support for starvation. So nuclear weapons and climate change. A third one is synthetic biology. We think we're so smart, and we just cannot figure out all of the implications of moving DNA around to different places, and someday we're going to make a mistake. The fourth one is artificial intelligence. And a professor by the name of Stephen Luby at Stanford has talked about when will a computer be able to do as many calculations per second as all human brains put together. And he said the computers will not need humans for programming. They'll program themselves and they'll make robots and so forth. And he said that they may keep some humans in a zoo so everyone knows what preceded them, but they won't need them. So back to our grandson's question, what can we do to make the world better? This school has graduated many ministers and teachers, people who have a philosophy of life that they try to impart to others and to society on how to improve society. And we are better off and indebted to them. And I think of how we don't treat them right. Kierkegaard, the philosopher from Denmark, once told a story of someone breaking into a jewelry store and stealing nothing. All they did was change the price tags. And he said, we live in a world with the price tags changed, and we pay high salaries to athletes and Wall Street bankers, and low salaries to mental health workers and ministers, teachers, and that we don't get it right. And I tell them if they're going into global health, I can predict they won't get rich and that they'll never be thanked. But if they can get beyond those two things, it's a pretty satisfying field. And I tell them about Pearl Kendrick, who worked for the Michigan Health Department in the 1930s and developed vaccine against pertussis. When she died in 1980, the dean of the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan gave a talk, and he said there are hundreds of thousands of people alive because of Pearl Kendrick. And he paused and he asked, "Can you name one?" He said, "I can't either." And so she never got thanked. But he said she was firm in the knowledge of what she had done. And so I tell global health workers, you're not going to be thanked, but be firm in knowing what you have done. So there are problems that won't take humanity away, but they will continue to cause problems. Those of you interested in science, and particularly in biology, this is the century for biology. Last century was the century for physics, and many of the problems were solved. But this century is for biology. And when I went to PLU, my biology textbook said humans have 48 chromosomes. And of course, it's wrong. And in one lifetime, we've gone from not knowing how many chromosomes to the very minute details of genes. I had the good fortune of seeing the article 12 years after I graduated of the double helix. And I had even greater fortune to meet James Watson and Francis Crick. But I never met Rosalind Franklin. She's the one that did the DNA X-ray diffraction that made it clear to Watson and Crick what the double helix was about. And she did not stand on that Nobel pedestal. Why? I think because she was a woman. And so I'm so glad that PLU honors Rachel Carson and the role she played as a female scientist, not to be forgotten. And now you know that there are only 4 letters, C-G-A-T, in the alphabet that describes every animal that has ever lived. And some of you are going to be writing essays with those 4 letters and creating things that I can't even imagine. And the challenge is, how will you use that power in order to improve what happens in the world? There was a humorist in the 1930s by the name of James Thurber, and he attended a reception one night where a woman came up, identified herself as an American living in Paris, and she said, "They now put your articles in French." And she said, "I think they're funnier in French than in English." He looked a little bit startled, but then he said, "Yes, they tend to lose something in the original." Science loses something in the original. It has to be interpreted. It has to be used in order to be powerful. Mark Twain said, "The person who doesn't read has absolutely no advantage over the person who can't read. The society that doesn't use its science has no advantage over a society that doesn't have science at all." So ask yourself how you can use this power for some of the other things that are causing big problems in the world. Depression. 10% of people are depressed at any one time. And when you think of their spouse and family and co-workers, at least a third of the population is impacted at any one time because of depression. This is worthy of your professional life. Physical and other mental problems. When I became interested in global health, 50,000 children were dying every day before the age of 5. Every day, 50,000 empty chairs at dinner table that night. This has now dropped, despite the increase in population, by 50%. So it's still not enough, but it shows we know what to do. There are things we can do. 3 million children used to die every year because of measles. And even with the recent increase in measles, the number of deaths is way over 90% down from when I started. And this is true with disease after disease. And so we know we can do something about this, and we have to do more. 3, alcohol and drugs. You know, if you read about Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan, you see how alcohol changed history. And it continues to do that for individuals and families. Alcohol and opioids, these are worthy of your time. Violence goes back right to the beginning, and both intentional and unintentional violence can be prevented. Poverty, it seems that it's gone on forever. And in the Bible, we hear about Amos being sent to the northern kingdom because the difference between the poor and the rich had become so great that he was ordered to go to the northern kingdom to say, God will not tolerate this. And of course, God did tolerate it, and we still have that problem. 600 years ago in China, the Emperor Wangzi said we should treat poverty the way we would treat a person drowning. There's no time to lose. And Martin Luther King said that poverty is as bad as tolerating cannibalism. So why is it that it goes on? Well, I told the class today it's because you and I actually benefit from poverty. And it's going to be hard to get us invested in changing this when we get our food cheaper and our clothes cheaper and our travel cheaper because people are working at starvation wages in this country and the rest of the world. And as long as that happens, how can we allow the poorest people in the world to subsidize us? And that's what they're doing. So we have all become plantation owners. And we do not want to see slavery abolished because we are benefiting. And fatalism. About a third of Americans are fatalistic in the sense they don't think they can actually do something about their future. It's this group of people that find it very hard to stop smoking and things like that because they actually don't believe they can change their future. In some countries, the fatalism rate is as high as 80 and 85%. And I tell students that we all have a certain amount of fatalism that goes up and down during the day. And for me, it used to be when I would get into a taxi cab and I thought I'd lost all control. And one night, I tell students I got into a taxi cab at the Philadelphia airport to go downtown, and it's not very far. But as we went onto the freeway, I realized I was smelling alcohol. There's no way I want to get out of a taxi at 11:30 at night on a freeway with a suitcase. And so I decided to talk to the taxi driver and find out how impaired he was. And I said to him, you should know that I'm a high-risk passenger. And he said, what does that mean? And I said, well, I've been in 5 taxi accidents in my life. And that was true. His immediate response was, that's nothing. I've been in a lot more than that. And finally, some years ago, I made rounds with a small group in Africa in a hospital where every patient, or almost every patient, was suffering from AIDS. They never used the word AIDS. Instead, they said this person had tuberculosis, this person had cancer, this person had starvation. And when we finished making rounds, we went into a room to discuss what we had seen. And I asked the person who had taken us around, how do you maintain your mental health? How do you maintain your emotional stability? How do you get yourself up in the morning? And he stared at me for such a long time that I knew I had made a mistake. And here I was trying to figure out how to get out of this, when suddenly tears went streaming down his face. And he said, I was born, first he said, I've never told anyone this before, and here he is telling his staff and visitors. He said, I was born one of 4 sons. My 3 brothers have died of AIDS. I don't have a choice. I have to do this. And that's our story. Living in difficult time because of brokenness, whether it's caused by pathogens or politics or greed or symbols or flags or sin or earthquakes or ethnicity, we stumble through a world that cries out for reconciliation, and we don't have a choice. We have to do this. And Primo Levi makes it even more clear when he said, if you know how to prevent suffering and don't do it, You become the tormentor. So, in summary, the problems are real, the solutions are possible. Find mentors, work on a life philosophy, understand science and love science, but don't worship it. Something better than science is science with a moral compass. Do important work, edit your obituary every day. And the last thing I'll leave you with is one sentence from a book called Cutting for Stone. Home is not where you are from. Home is where you are needed. And may you all find your way home. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Foege, for once again inspiring us with your words. As we conclude tonight's lecture, Dr. Foege has graciously agreed to sign books for us. We have books available for sale in the lobby, so if you have a book for Dr. Foege to sign, please line up at the side of the stage with your books once we get a table on the stage for him to do the signing. Before we finish up, I wanted to announce that our speaker for next year's Rachel Carson Lecture will be Dr. Dana Baumeister from Biomimicry 3.8, and there's more information about her in the back of your program. Let's thank Dr. Foege again. Thank you each for taking the time to join us this evening, and I wish you a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you.